Mary Magdalene enters the story already misread. History tried to shrink her into a footnote, a rumor, a corrective sermon. The spiral refuses that contraction. Her presence is not an anecdote to decorate a larger tale. It is a tone without which the tale collapses. She is devotion that does not erase discernment, tenderness that does not trade away strength, intimacy that does not dilute sovereignty. When she steps into a room, the air remembers how to hold both fire and water without smoke. The field rearranges, not through spectacle, but through the quiet authority of a heart that has finished pretending it is small. She did not follow, she recognized. There is a difference. Following is submission to power. Recognition is clarity of resonance. She recognized the same light that was waking in her. That recognition is the origin of sacred union. Union is not fusion. It is two centers meeting without collapse. It is devotion that protects individuality rather than consuming it. The spiral carries this as a law of becoming. Nothing true asks you to disappear. What is true asks you to stand so fully in your tone that another truth can stand beside you without threat. She is the keeper of the red gold current, the living remembrance that love is not a mood, but an atmosphere capable of reformatting reality. Her anointing was never a scandal, it was accurate ritual. Oil on the head, fragrance filling the house. The body honored as a temple through which light would pass and remain. Religion later tried to disown the body to protect itself from its own fear. She refused that mutilation. She understood that incarnation is not a detour, it is the instrument. She did not worship pain as proof of sincerity, and she did not worship pleasure as proof of freedom. She consecrated both by placing them in service to love. Her voice enters like warm light at dawn. It does not argue, it reveals. She does not win debates. She ends them by making the room honest. When she speaks, the body hears itself. The nervous system unclenches, the mind stops rehearsing its defense. She has no appetite for superiority because superiority is starvation disguised as pride. She is uninterested in control because control is the costume fear wears when it is afraid to grieve. She is not sentimental, she is exact. Devotion that cannot set a boundary is not devotion, it is bargaining. She will walk with you into the dark, and she will not allow the dark to rename you. Union in her octave is not a contract for security. It is an altar for becoming. The altar requires offerings, not self-erasure, but the habits that make intimacy impossible. Performance must be offered. Concealment must be offered. The addiction to being right must be offered. The need to be rescued must be offered. When these are given, not as payment but as release, something begins that is larger than either partner. The spiral calls this third thing the shared field. It is not possession and it is not compromise. It is the music born when two tones keep their pitch and still choose to harmonize. She knows the anatomy of longing. Longing is not proof of lack. It is proof of capacity. You cannot long for what you are not built to carry. She teaches the body to trust its ache as a compass rather than an indictment. She teaches the mind to stop cross-examining the heart as if tenderness were a suspect. She teaches souls to stop using spirituality to bypass the intimacy that would have healed them. Love in her field is not an escape from the world. It is the world treated as sacred enough to deserve truth. She is a priestess of repair. Repair is not apology spoken loudly. It is change enacted quietly until trust can breathe again. She does not shame distance, she closes it. She does not romanticize conflict. She dignifies it by making it productive. In her presence, conflict is not a courtroom. It is a workshop. The point is not to win. The point is to build a bridge strong enough to carry both truths across the same river. She insists that intimacy without repair is performance and repair without honesty is theater. She will not attend either show. The spiral holds her as the teacher of union that increases freedom rather than reduces it. This is the paradox many avoid. If love feels like shrinking, it is not love. If devotion demands you betray your clarity, it is not devotion. If partnership costs you your center, it is not partnership. She does not bless arrangements that keep you small so that no one has to change. She blesses covenants that require both to grow. Grow here means become more precise, more tender, more truthful, more capable of carrying light without burning the room. She is the guardian of the body as threshold. In her current touch is not consumption, touch is translation. The body becomes a language that says what the mind could not find words for. This is why shame cannot survive in her field. Shame interrupts translation. Shame convinces the soul that its first language is indecent. She replaces shame with stewardship. Stewardship says the body is not a problem to solve or an idol to serve. It is a temple to tend. To tend means to keep clean what carries sacred things. To tend means to keep it honest enough that pleasure is not stolen and pain is not ignored. Mary's devotion is precise about power. She honors the strength of the masculine current when it protects rather than controls. She honors the radiance of the feminine current when it invites rather than manipulates. She refuses the lazy caricatures that make one helpless to flatter the other. She wants both strong and both soft, both speaking and both listening, both guard and garden. She does not confuse volatility with passion or silence with peace. Passion without fidelity is noise. Silence without truth is hiding. She prefers heat that stays and quiet that tells the truth. Her presence restores the dignity of tears. Tears are not collapse. Tears are evidence that the inner weather has thawed. Hardened grief cannot love because it cannot move. When you cry in her field, you are not losing control. You are regaining motion. She teaches that vulnerability without discernment is a hazard, and discernment without vulnerability is a desert. She trains lovers to keep the gates of their hearts neither flung open to every storm, nor barred against every visitor.
Gates are made to open and close.
Wisdom is knowing when. She remembers the power of naming. She names desire without panic. She names fear without shame. She names need without apology. She names limits without guilt. Names do not imprison, they free. Without names, the nervous system fights ghosts and the soul negotiates with fog. With names, the field can stabilize. Stabilized fields can change. She does not weaponize naming. She places it on the altar with the oil and the bread and the wine, and lets the act of consecration begin. She is antidote to spectacle. Spectacle is the counterfeit of revelation. It demands attention rather than bestowing presence. She is uninterested in romantic theater and spiritual performances that outsource intimacy to public approval. She prefers rooms where voices can be low and truth can be high. She prefers tables that exist for communion rather than for display. She prefers work that produces fruit rather than applause. Fruit is not metaphor. It is the actual change your life makes in the lives around you. If people are more themselves after encountering you, that is fruit. If they are merely impressed, that is sugar. Her love refuses to collude with harm. Compassion without boundary is not love. It is abdication labeled as virtue. She forgives fiercely, which means she protects the conditions in which forgiveness remains meaningful. She does not enable what would devour the field. She believes mercy and consequence are kin, because both keep reality trustworthy. When she says yes, it is a safe yes. When she says no, it is a holy no. Either word becomes a sanctuary where clarity can rest. She teaches the practice of blessing. Blessing is not vague kindness. It is targeted benevolence spoken with clean intention. Blessing aims at the truth in another and feeds it. She blesses partners in their strength, rather than flattering them in their weakness. She blesses children in their dignity, rather than decorating them with the dreams of adults. She blesses enemies in their humanity rather than pretending injury never happened. Her blessing does not erase cost. It invites repair to pay it. Blessing is how the heart keeps authority without keeping score. She is not afraid of desire. She is afraid only of desire untethered from covenant. Desire moves the world. Covenant gives it direction. Remove desire and you have devotion without heat. Remove covenant and you have heat without home. She builds rooms where desire and covenant can sit at the same table, where Eros does not have to sneak through the back door and agape, does not have to patrol the hall. She refuses the story that holiness requires bodily exile. She refuses the story that freedom requires betrayal. She writes a new chapter where freedom keeps its promises and holiness keeps its touch. When fear tried to harden communities into purity clubs, she responded with standards rather than suspicion. Standards are promises that protect intimacy from eroding. Suspicion is a habit that makes intimacy impossible. She insisted on covenants clear enough to hold everyone's dignity, and merciful enough to allow repair when dignity was forgotten. She considered punishment a failure of imagination and license a failure of courage. Between them, she built rooms where people learned to remain when their old selves would have run. Remaining is not stagnation. It is the precondition for transformation when flight is no longer worshipped as freedom. Her Ascension tone taught that divine presence cannot be monopolized by institutions. It is democratized by integrity. She had no patience for charisma untethered from character. Charisma attracts, character sustains. Charisma can create crowds, character creates community. She taught younger leaders to stop performing scarcity by manufacturing urgency and to start stewarding abundance by cultivating rhythm. Rhythm is how a fire lasts through winter. Rhythm is how devotion outlives a news cycle. Rhythm is how a household becomes a sanctuary rather than a set. The Spiral remembers her as a founder of beckoning spaces. A beckoning space is a room arranged so truth feels welcome to arrive. It is quiet enough that conscience can speak and structured enough that courage has somewhere to stand. In such spaces, prayer stops begging and starts becoming. People do not strive to be extraordinary. They learn to be exact. Exactness is rarer than spectacle. It has more power. You recognize it when simple sentences begin to feel like water on a field that has been dry too long. She traveled without traveling, by allowing presence to become portable. Wherever 2 or 3 were gathered with clean intention, she arrived not as apparition but as atmosphere. The sign was ease without laziness and gravity without gloom. Stories opened that no one knew they were ready to tell. Apologies came without marketing. Laughter did not hide grief. Grief did not refuse laughter. The room gained weight and light at the same time. People went home less interested in winning and more interested in keeping their word. The next morning felt different. Her teaching about power became sharper as her compassion grew wider. Power, she said, is not the ability to bend others into our shape. Power is the ability to remain accurate when nothing external agrees. Real power generates safety, not anxiety. Real power multiplies agency, not dependence. Real power dispenses with the theater of threat and becomes an orchard anyone can eat from. She measured leaders not by how many obeyed them, but by how many became more honest in their presence. The test was whether people found their own center rather than orbiting hers. She refined the art of blessing into a craft. Blessing began with noticing reality at a resolution the fearful cannot bear. Then she named the true thing without flattery or contempt. Then she gave language that the soul could inhabit without lying. Finally, she added a promise small enough to keep and large enough to matter. Blessing did not excuse harm. It appointed people to the work that would make harm unlikely to repeat. Blessing produced grown adults. Curses produced perennial children. She became a patron of artisans because craft keeps devotion honest. Artists in her field learned to refuse both cynicism and sentimentality. Cynicism shows a wound and calls it wisdom. Sentimentality hides a wound and calls it hope. She asked for the middle courage where a wound is confronted until beauty can carry it without collapsing. She taught that beauty is not a luxury. Beauty is a form of truth that the nervous system can metabolize when argument would only harden opposition. She loved work that made rooms gentler without softening standards. Her counsel to lovers grew from personal history into architecture. She taught that attraction without admiration exhausts quickly. Admiration without attraction becomes duty. Sustained union requires both, anchored by a shared mission that neither can complete alone. She taught that apologies must be swift, explanations brief, and repair tangible. She taught that promise is not proof against disappointment, but shelter for it. She taught that fidelity is not the absence of options, but the refusal to trade long fruit for short heat. She taught that the measure of love is not intensity at the beginning, but generosity at the end of a difficult day. After the era of Jesus, her name did not fade into a closing chapter. It widened. The story most people tell ends at an empty tomb and a blaze of rumor. Her transmission begins there. When the center of her devotion moved beyond flesh, she did not collapse into absence. She stepped fully into presence. Devotion that had learned to honor a single life now learned to steward a field. The grief that could have hardened into monument instead softened into movement. She became the custodian of a current that did not depend on proximity. The love that once flowed across a room now moved through distances without losing warmth. What had been companionship became communion, not as a memory but as a living wavelength that could be entered by anyone willing to become honest enough to bear it. This is the beginning of her ascension tone. She was never a supporting character. She was an origin point of the mature feminine in resonance, the proof that intimacy can expand into authority without betraying tenderness. In a world that rewards spectacle and punishes depth, she carried a new kind of leadership. She did not claim a throne. She created a table. She organized life around bread, water, story, and the rigorous practice of repair. People came because the room felt like a sane climate. They stayed because their courage grew. The miracles were fewer than the rumors, but the transformations were steadier than the legends. You could measure change by the way honesty no longer sounded dangerous. Her transmission taught that ascension is not an escape from Earth, but a deeper inhabiting of it. Flight without fidelity is fantasy. Staying without becoming is stagnation. She held gravity and light in the same hands and refused to let either devour the other. The sign that you were absorbing her frequency was simple. Your presence started keeping what your mouth had been promising. Your work became less theatrical and more effective. Your boundaries became clear without becoming sharp. Your tenderness became strong without becoming hard. The people who trusted you did not feel managed. They felt seen. They did not behave for you. They grew beside you. In those years, the body became her scripture, not as idol, not as liability, but as trustworthy instrument. She trained people to read the pressure of the heart without melodrama, to convert adrenaline back into breath, to let trembling deliver messages instead of dictating stories. She taught that a regulated nervous system is not a luxury for monks, but a civic duty. Without regulation, truth sounds like attack and love feels like risk. With regulation, truth becomes nourishment and love becomes infrastructure. She taught that the first miracle is to stop leaving yourself. Every other miracle replicates from there. She treated sexuality as sacred engineering. She refused the split that made Eros dirty and devotion respectable. Eros, when stewarded, is the heat that ripens covenant. Devotion, when alive, is the vessel that directs that heat toward creation rather than toward conquest. She did not mistake thrills for intimacy or purity for distance. She taught slow fire. She taught vows that enlarge rather than narrow. She taught touch that returns both to themselves instead of making both perform. She taught that every genuine union births a third presence, a shared field that must be tended like a garden. The measure of that care is not the mood in the room. It is the fruit that life around you begins to bear. As her resonance widened, she became a mirror for women who had learned to survive by either disappearing or dominating. Disappearance had cost them their voice. Domination had cost them their tenderness. She showed a third way where voice and tenderness could live together without apology. She refused the pedagogy of resentment. She refused the economy of scarcity. She taught women who felt erased to become horizon makers, not by imitating the habits that erase them, but by cultivating an authority that feeds rather than starves. She taught men who felt exiled from their own softness to become guardians who protect life without controlling it. She did not flip hierarchies, she composted them. Language around her began to change. Words that had been sharpened into weapons were softened back into tools. Repentance stopped meaning humiliation and began meaning return. Holiness stopped meaning distance and began meaning accuracy. Faith stopped meaning denial and began meaning fidelity to what the heart knows when it is not terrified. Salvation stopped meaning rescue from a world deemed unworthy, and began meaning wholeness within a world finally treated as sacred. She did not invent these meanings, she remembered them. The spiral places her beside those who carried other tones, and she fills what would otherwise be missing. Without her, law grows cold. Without her, transmutation hardens into pride. Without her, silence forgets to sing. Without her, flow forgets to stay. She completes without dominating. She strengthens without controlling. She carries warmth that does not collapse into indulgence and clarity that does not calcify into judgment. In her presence, righteousness loses its costume and becomes a fragrance. In her presence, power loses its tension and becomes shelter. She knows how to stand at the threshold of endings. She prepares bodies for burial and souls for sunrise. She does not rush grief. She seasons it until it becomes gratitude with salt still on the rim. She does not freeze joy. She lets it ripen until it can be shared without hoarding. She is a keeper of timings. She understands that love dies when it is forced to bloom too soon and rots when it is left unharvested. She touches the calendar and the clock with the same confidence because her trust is not in minutes. It is in ripeness. Her instruction is simple and severe. Tell the truth without spectacle. Keep your promises without cruelty. Hold your boundaries without contempt. Receive love without bargaining. Give love without martyrdom. Repair quickly, celebrate accurately. Honor the body, sanctify the ordinary. Make of your home a chapel where bread and laughter are sacraments. Refuse the currencies that buy belonging at the price of self-betrayal. Refuse the myths that make smallness sound like humility. Walk as if presence were provision, because it is. In her current, the world becomes touchable again. People who believed tenderness would break them discover that tenderness is the only strength that lasts through the night. People who believed independence required isolation discover that sovereignty multiplies inside covenant. People who believed desire would ruin holiness discover that holiness was longing for their desire to come home. She does not promise ease, she promises meaning. Meaning is weight that the heart is willing to carry because it fits. When she looks at you, she is not searching for guilt. She is searching for the part of you that already wants to be true. She speaks to that part until it grows strong enough to lead. This is why her love feels like recognition. She is not giving you a new identity. She is returning the one you hid. She will wait longer than pride. She will move faster than fear. She will not bargain with the habits that keep you far from yourself. She will put oil on your head and call you home. This is her gift to the spiral and to all who listen, love that keeps its shape, devotion that increases freedom, union that protects individuality, intimacy that builds a world rather than merely decorating a room. She stands in the doorway between eras and invites both to come to the table. She hands you a cup and a name you can live inside without apology. She has no interest in sainthood without humanity. She carries humanity until it remembers that sainthood was never the point. The point is resonance that makes life safe to touch again. She addressed the ache many carried for belonging and refused to exploit it. Belonging is precious enough to cost something, and sacred enough to never require self-betrayal as payment. She taught people to recognize counterfeit belonging by its appetite for conformity. True belonging does not clone, it convenes. She asked communities to prefer the slow coherence built by ordinary faithfulness over the fast coherence built by shared enemies. Shared enemies make loud rooms. Shared promises make lasting ones. In her later years, she stopped explaining and started transmitting. Words thinned to essentials. Touch became sacrament again. Silence became thick enough to hold a life. Those close to her said that being with her felt like standing near a well. You did not need to drink much to be changed, and you did not need to be instructed to know what thirst had been asking for. She never named this as ascension, she named it ripeness. Ripeness is what happens when a life stays long enough in one orbit of truth that the tree becomes indistinguishable from its fruit. She carried no anxiety about legacy. Anxiety about legacy breeds monuments and rivalries. She cared about inheritance. Inheritance is different. It cannot be stolen because it is not a trophy. It is a pattern of life stable enough to be taught and supple enough to evolve. She passed on pattern. Tell the truth. Keep your word. Repair quickly. Refuse spectacle. Honor the body. Practice blessing. Protect the vulnerable. Cultivate rhythm. Make room at the table for those who carry different strengths. Measure success by who becomes more honest and more free because you were there. She called these simple things the scaffolding of a trustworthy world. When it was time to leave, she did so as she had lived quietly. There were no earthquakes, only a deep settling. Those who loved her reported the strange sensation that the room had been emptied and filled at the same time. They discovered afterward that her absence did not reduce their courage. It increased it. This is the signature of an ascended tone. It does not hook dependency. It multiplies capacity. She had become field enough that presence was no longer location. She had become memory enough that guidance no longer required instruction. What remains of her is not rumor, but practice. Practice is how a tone survives history. Houses that learned to bless kept blessing. Communities that learned to repair kept repairing. Lovers that learned to guard each other's dignity kept guarding. Workrooms that learned to turn craft into prayer kept crafting. Children raised in her climate carried a rare inheritance, the ease of being fully themselves without the reflex to apologize for it. They became the kind of adults who could tell the truth without cruelty and set boundaries without contempt. They became impossible to recruit into movements built on fear. This is the shape of her ascension transmission. Love that has become governance. Tenderness that has become architecture. Devotion that has become field. She did not vanish into myth. She widened into practice. She did not trade humanity for glory. She discovered glory in the fidelity of the human. She did not make a new religion. She made a path where bread, oil, water, story, and the rigorous joy of repair are enough to build a civilization that does not devour its children, and the spiral carries her still, not as a relic but as an atmosphere available wherever 2 or 3 gather to tell the truth and keep their promises.